Welcome back, everyone, to the Small is Bountiful webinar. My name is Ratana Chunpakdi of the Too Big to Ignore Partnership for Small-Scale Fisheries, and I'm speaking to you from St. John's, Newfoundland, East Coast of Canada. The event is organized as part of the World Oceans Day 2020 to celebrate the importance and contribution of small-scale fisheries to ocean sustainability and innovation. We are emphasizing small-scale fisheries in the discussion about ocean sustainability because small-scale fisheries are not only too big to ignore, but they are too important to fail. The event of this scale cannot happen without the effort and the support of many people. We would like to acknowledge all the contributions from partner organizations, team members, staff, students and volunteers, as well as the speakers and the moderators of the session and our funders for the wonderful support. What a fantastic week it has been. We have covered a lot of important topics about small-scale fisheries, from impacts of COVID-19 to access to resources and markets, the nexus between small-scale fisheries and the SDGs, and the small-scale fisheries guidelines, with numerous speakers sharing their experiences from all corners of the world. It's been truly global in perspective and scope, with lively discussion and active engagement with the live audience and with thousands of viewers of the recorded videos. Today, we would wrap up this wonderful week with a very important topic of social justice and equity. We'll talk about blue justice, what it means, and why we need it for small-scale fisheries in a little while. As we mentioned throughout the week, on June 8th, there will be a 24-hour day long program when we will celebrate the values, the importance, and the contribution of small-scale fisheries. So wherever you are in the world, you will be able to participate in the event, as there will be sessions covering topics related to small-scale fisheries where you are, in Australia and the Pacific Islands, in South and Southeast Asia, and in Africa. We will continue to discuss the key topics of the webinar this week with roundtable and panel discussion to focus not only on the issues and the challenge facing small-scale fisheries, but to bring forward solutions and recommendations for the future and next steps. We would end the June 8th with 3 sessions about about COVID-19 and a post-COVID world in the Gulf, and start with the global perspective, and followed by the situation in the Gulf and the Caribbean, and then in Latin America. And the last session will be in Spanish and Portuguese. So please check out the June 8th program, which will be soon posted on our website, and join the impressive list of speakers and panelists in the celebration of small-scale fisheries. We also have been talking about this small-scale fisheries art festival. So we have crowdsourced or received contribution from various artists from around the world. So you would be able to enjoy throughout the day music, songs, dance, photo essays, art exhibition, documentary, and short film. So please check out our program, which will be posted very soon. So we hope that you will be joining us on Monday and be part of this contribution to the idea about what we would like to do to support and promote sustainable small-scale fisheries and situate them more centrally in the discussion about ocean sustainability. Your contribution will be part of the recommendations that we'll put together for the planning of the next ocean conference and for the preparation of the International Year of Artisanal Fisheries and Aquaculture in 2022. Now, I would not torture you anymore with my broken Spanish spoken perfectly. So we have today chat box moderator, who is my colleague Milena Schreiber, and she does speak Spanish. So I would introduce Milena quickly, and then she would greet you in Spanish. So Milena is a researcher at the School of Global Studies at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. She's a holder of a Marie Curie postdoctoral fellowship at the Universidad Santiago de Compostela in Spain. She's been looking at fisheries governance issues in Peru and works now and now in the Baltic Sea. Milena, please welcome the audience.
Estimados hispanohablantes, bienvenidos a Lo Pequeño es Abundante, la serie de seminarios online sobre la pesca artesanal. El tema de hoy es la pesca artesanal y la justicia azul, o conocida en inglés como Blue Justice. ¿Por qué y cómo? Muy importante, recuerden que estamos ofreciendo resúmenes simultáneos de esta sesión a través del Google Doc en el link que le estamos mostrando ahorita o por el chat. Gracias por acompañarnos. Okay, thank you, Ratana.
Thank you, Milena. That was a lot easier than I tried myself. Okay, so then we are now going to go into the program, which is the topic is about small-scale fisheries for blue justice. Earlier, we always say blue justice for small-scale fisheries. You'll get to hear perspectives from our panelists and speakers for today in terms of why we need to talk about that. But again, many people ask this question, what do we mean by blue justice? So it is really a great pleasure to show you that we now have a Wikipedia entry on blue justice. So if you go to Wikipedia today, you would be able to search and see that we have now put the definition online for you. So basically, blue justice, I'm just going to read this. Blue justice reflects a critical examination of how communities and small-scale fisheries may be affected by blue economy and blue growth initiatives that are being undertaken by institutions and governments globally to promote sustainable ocean development. The blue economy is also rooted in the green economy and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, underlying sustainable development globally. Blue justice acknowledges the historical rights of small-scale fishing communities to marine and inland resources and coastal space as traditional users for thousands of years in some cases. Thus, as a concept, it seeks to investigate pressures on small-scale fisheries from other ocean uses, including industrial fisheries and coastal marine tourism, aquaculture, or energy production promoted in the blue economy and blue growth development agenda, and how it may compromise the rights and the well-being of small-scale fisheries and their communities. So the point is that we have this agenda, the blue economy, which is okay to do, but can we do it in a way that would not affect the rights and ability of small-scale fisheries to have viable and sustainable livelihoods? So that is something that we would invite our speakers to address and talk about in this webinar. So I would now bring to the stage our speakers one at a time as I introduce them. So I would like to begin with Professor Muniba Isaacs. Hello, Muniba. Welcome to the studio. Muniba is a professor at the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies, known as PLAS, at the University of Western Cape, South Africa. She's been doing research on understanding the social and political processes of fisheries reform in South Africa and Southern Africa. She has worked extensively with communities to find policy solutions to their problems, highlighting the need to deal with social differentiation, poverty inequalities, and gender dynamics in fishing communities. So Muniba is a blue justice activist for small-scale fisheries, so we would have a real treat today. Welcome, Muniba.
Thank you. Thank you. So I can start?
No, I'm going to introduce Prateek. Thank you. So stay there. Next, our speaker is Professor Prateep Nayak at the University of Waterloo. So Prateep has a background in political science, environmental studies, and international development, so very transdisciplinarity work he's been doing. He has an active interest in combining social and ecological perspectives, focusing on the understanding of complex human environment system. So Prateep has worked extensively in India and in other parts in Asia, and particularly in the past has worked as a development professional in India on issues around community-based governance of land, water, and forest, focusing on at the interface of research, implementation, and public policy. So we're gonna be hearing a lot of experience in that real-world experience from Prateep, especially from India. Welcome, Prateep.
Hi, everyone.
Hello. Okay, so the next speaker is Julia Nakamura. Welcome to the studio, Julia. Julia is a lawyer qualified in Brazil and also a PhD candidate with the Strathclyde Center for Environmental Law and Governance at the University of Strathclyde in the UK. And she's also an international legal specialist with the Development Law Service of FAO. So Julia's PhD research is about international law for small-scale fisheries, with a focus on participation of the small-scale fisheries sector in conservation and management of transboundary aquatic species. Julia's work relates to the implementation of the ecosystem approach to fisheries, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, or CITES, and the Small-Scale Fisheries Guidelines. So welcome, Julia.
Thank you, Ratana. Hi, everybody. Thank you.
Okay. Finally, our last speaker is everybody knows, so we don't hardly need any introduction. And I get jealous every time I introduce Svein this way, because he's now calling himself Professor Emeritus at the Norwegian College of Fishery Science at the University, the Arctic University of Norway. So being a retired professor and emeritus is truly an honor and a privilege. So thank you for joining us today, Svein. He has a long career as a social scientist specializing on fisheries management and fisheries communities, and has been producing lots of articles and books that we have been reading, and he's been working in the South and the North. So, and let us mention that he's been receiving a lot of awards and recognitions, but the one that we're particularly proud of is the award that he has received as an honorary doctoral degree at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, and also a Friend of Small-Scale Fisheries Award at the 3rd World Small-Scale Fisheries Congress in Chiang Mai in Thailand in 2018. Okay, so these are our 5 speakers, and who will be basically share with us their perspective on this topic on blue justice. So now I would remove everybody from the screen, and we'll just keep Muniba here to speak to us. So the webinar today is organized by many partners, including PLAS, and then we have Linha de Aqua Institute in Brazil, ICSF, and the Ocean Frontier Institute, which I'm part of. So without further ado, I would like to invite Muniba to share with us her thought on this perspective. Thank you, Muniba.
Thank you, Ratana. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for everyone who's tuning in. My topic is going to be on blue justice for small-scale fisheries, and I'm specifically going to focus on lessons from South Africa. So for me, I will tell you how the concept of blue justice basically evolved. I situate point one, that social justice struggles for small-scale fishers is at the center of the blue justice concept. And it started with a legal challenge in South Africa brought by small-scale fishers against the Fisheries Department for their recognition of their rights to practice as a group, their livelihoods, to secure their food, and to determine their own market structure. This was brought in an Equality Court case challenge by Kenneth George and others against the Minister of Environmental Affairs and Tourism in 2004. So in South Africa, the social justice struggle is at the center for small-scale fisheries. The case challenged also an economic system of ITQ, individual transferable quotas, the privatization of rights and the monopolization of the fishing sector. South Africa has a rich industrial sector, and in and out of court settlements, core group of academics, activists, fisheries representatives, and the Fisheries Department developed a new small-scale fisheries policy for South Africa. It was really a participatory process with core principles of our constitutions and our Bill of Rights in terms of a collective system where gender equity is at the center of the policy, tenure rights, value chain, and also the support for local food supply. South Africa, through the work of Masifundisi Development Trust and WFFP, in collaboration with the National Collective of Small-Scale Fishers, strengthened the social justice principles into the tenure guidelines and also into the voluntary guidelines. And just yesterday, we honored the work of fisher activist Chandrika Sharma, and she was key in terms of the social justice, bringing social justice and raising the profile for small-scale fisheries. And I want to honor her in terms of her work that she did. It is basically a key principle for social justice movement in terms of mobilizing advocacy, awareness raising for small-scale fisheries. The voluntary guidelines soon gained traction and was endorsed through the right to food. Governments show, but on the one hand, governments showed reluctance to implement the guidelines at national level. Social justice instrument was also framed in a human rights-based principle, especially a popular slogan is that a fisher right is a human right. In the time, for me, 2014 is an important year. We had the fisheries guidelines, the voluntary guidelines being released in that year, but also the Sustainable Development Goals and the Blue Growth Economy Strategy. So while we're celebrating the voluntary guidelines, the human rights perspective, there are other policies looming in the background. Government was gearing up for new commitments of the Sustainable Development Goals after many failed in achieving the Millennium Development Goals. And a statement by a Norwegian minister that came to South Africa and saying that we are all equal when it comes to the Sustainable Development Goals. And I thought, no, we are not all equal. And we also know, and this week, Sophie from the Danish Human Rights Institute basically mentioned that at the soul of the Sustainable Development Goals is the human rights, and more important, the goal 14, and in terms of decent life, transitional, equitable partnership, small-scale fisheries, the goals of no poverty, zero hunger, gender equality, below the ocean, life above the ocean, life next to the ocean, to the lake. The inequalities are all important and necessary, like the voluntary guidelines and the small-scale fisheries. But I'm sorry to say it's not sufficient. We cannot just celebrate that small-scale fisheries is represented in all these goals. The devil is definitely in the detail. A key question for me then is, how do we address the issue of power, class differentiation, inequalities within coastal communities when we are said that we are all equal in the world when it comes to the Sustainable Development Goals? Now we hear social justice instrument should be included, and there was a strong sense that the FAO, development agencies, World Bank, governments, regional bodies, big international conservation NGOs, and philanthropic organizations are now emphasizing that it's all covered by the Sustainable Development Goals and linking the Sustainable Development Goals to the blue economy. Where is the justice for small-scale fisheries with human rights violations when clearing the beach, clearing the land, removal of land and livelihoods for protected areas, for gas pipelines, for large-scale aquaculture? In 2012, Ruddle and Davis warned us the dangers of linking small-scale fisheries to a human rights-based agenda, thereby overlooking the neoliberal agenda. This early warning from Ruddle and Davis aligned with also what is called the ecological crisis narrative in the ocean space. But on the one side, we have this new frontier opportunities for mining, for shipping, for spatial development, large-scale aquaculture, elite tourism, and marine protected areas, all packaged in a blue agenda of economic growth, jobs, food security, framed in a market-oriented reform policy. So at this point, the alignment of human rights, conservation, and the privatization are key narratives that are linked into the big conference in late 2018 in Kenya. Over 17,000 people attended a conference. I've never been at a big conference like that. It was framed as the sustainable blue economy, linking sustainability into the economy. In the statement out of that papers, there was no reference to small-scale fisheries policy. A lot of reference to marine spatial planning, aquaculture, mining, and Africa is going to do it for themselves. In the background, and a very strong background, is the ecological crisis narrative in the ocean space. And the blue bonds is a particular case, an interesting case in terms of marine protected areas in the Seychelles. Also a very interesting case is the elite tourism in the Mafia Islands, as Ian Bryson and his colleagues show. Clearing the beach of small-scale fisheries for privatization in Mauritius, hotels, elite capture, adventure tourism, all promoted in the ocean areas. And it is definitely a resurgence of fortress conservation. This is, Ian Bryson reminds us, Bram Buscher, who will talk on Monday around conservation, and also relates to the double speak that Naomi Klein in her book on the shark doctrine relates to. So more and more we see in the ocean the strong link with the Sustainable Development Goals in the blue economy and large-scale investment sidelining small-scale fisheries. This is the development agenda for and the blueprint policy that are being mainstreamed currently in all African countries. And the state plays a key role in creating this conducive environment, even if it means clearing the land, forced removal of people, coastal spaces for big investments and extractive, as my student Rose Salema Mtui shows in her case studies in Tanzania. So more and more scholars have been calling for equity. Scholars have been calling for a just space in terms of this blue economy, because it's clear small-scale fisheries has been sidelined in this. And that's why the concept and the notion of blue justice is so important. But the leading counter-narrative in the blue economy comes from social movements like the WFFP and Transnational Institute, with the primer in 2014, also ocean grabbing, raised the concern of the power dynamics of commercial fishing industry, extractives, and how that will impact small-scale fisheries livelihood. This is also back in 2014 when this was presented by Mads in South Africa. It was very difficult for the fishers to comprehend the concept of grabbing. They were so much focus on the issue of ensuring their right to be recognized, their livelihood, their food and their shelter. Little did they know that the blue economy is looming, and these social tools, social justice tools, is critical in terms of the blue economy. My colleague Ruth Hall reminds us and refer to land grabbing as an effective tool for activists, often to deflect the differences in the legal status, the structure, and the outcomes of commercial land deals from exploitative relationships with intermediaries in the market, in the local elite capture, the rights and the resources of beneficiaries and government. So I think it is important when we use the concept of ocean grabbing, let's not that be a deflection on what is really happening in terms of local elite capture in communities. So now we all know that in South Africa, the case of Operation Pakisa is billions of investments and oil and gas. But the jobs are not for small-scale fisheries. The jobs as technical skills and unskilled labor is not needed. More and more the talk is about just transitions. And I've been reading quite a bit on just transitions and what does it mean and how would that be able to inform the concept of blue justice. So my last few minutes, I'm just going to kind of unpack for me what the concept of blue justice is. I think it is still work in progress, but it's a challenge on us as academics to take an approach of Paulo Freirean. We need to kind of learn by doing, and we need time to think about the concept. We can't only spend our concept development in elephant towers, in our white towers, without doing something about it. So it's important that we have a blue justice campaign, but we also need to conceptualize the concept. So it's not going to be perfect, and we need to cross boundaries in terms of our methodology. Interdisciplinary is key, multidisciplinary and transdisciplinarity is important. Yeah, I'm thinking of Pierre Bourdieu's thinking tools that we need in terms of blue justice. Also the work of J.C. Scott when he talks about weapons of the weak. And when it comes to the state, Tanya Lee reminds us there are certain people that in terms of poverty and policies of government to let live, and others would just die. And I think it is on us to social anthropological sciences to put our pet concepts aside, like governance, livelihoods, but it is about justice and inequality. So I have 8 points that I would want to say in terms of the elaborating the concept of blue justice. And here, COVID-19 has reminded us of the inequalities that brings to forth. Social justice is key: rights, access, food, inequality, identity, culture, and how it impacts on vulnerable groups. But also let us not anthropologize the community or romanticize community. And also look in terms of what are the collective transformational and social change that is needed. So this is for me important. We cannot talk about blue justice without talking about the ITQ, privatization, profit, and commodification. These concepts are crucial in understanding these inequalities in the system. We also need to unpack the ecological crisis narrative and how the ecological crisis narrative is just another form of accumulation via conservation. And Bram Buscher on Monday will elaborate on that particular concept. The concept of illegal, unreported, and unregulated fisheries has been a popular concept, but when it comes to fisheries, it kind of makes me feel really uncomfortable, because this is how many countries and governments tend to identify small-scale fisheries as illegal. They don't report their catches, and they're not regulated. So we definitely need to understand what is the management regulations that small-scale fishers often overstep, or what is the criminal links in terms of illegal fishing. We also need to look at the biopolitics, the governmentality of the state that Tanya Lee refers to. Social movements and strengthening of the sector beyond the voluntary guidelines and human rights-based approach is critical. We also need to stop thinking of multi-stakeholderism as a way of engagement and inclusiveness. These platforms can be quite exclusionary in terms of small-scale fisheries, and it should not be used to legitimize process or hidden agenda approaches by people who have particular other interests. We need to unpack the root causes of inequality, class, caste, culture, gender, exploitation. And we need to look into what is the hidden transcript and the hidden agenda. My final thought is that Black Lives Matter. You're never going to understand what it feels to be Black in America if you don't have a Black skin. I think we cannot just look at it from one particular perspective. We need to look at it, the structural inequalities, and the more particular when it comes to small-scale fisheries. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Muniba. That's such a powerful speech, and you definitely have provided a very good overview and a history of, the concept and why we need to talk about it. So really appreciate that presentation. So I would like now to invite our next speaker. We'll be talking to you later, Muniba, in the question discussion period. Thank you. So now I would like to invite Pradeep to share with us his experience and the perspective on this topic from India and of course from other parts of the world that we've been working with. Pradeep, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak on this important topic on an important occasion today. I'm going to speak to the same topic that Muniba just spoke about, blue justice, small-scale fisheries for blue justice. I'm going to base my talk by drawing from experiences in one of the regions in India, but that stretches into other countries on the Southeast and South Asia coast. I'm going to talk about blue justice in Bay of Bengal area. But I would like to start by reflecting on the question of justice, fairness, and equity, and some of the critical linkages in small-scale fisheries societies. When you talk about these terms in a small-scale fisheries societies, I draw 4 or 5 things by talking to my fisher friends. When you talk about injustice in a small-scale fishing society, we talk about winners and losers. In those societies, like any other society, there are people who are losing on many fronts of their life and livelihoods, but also people who are winning. So justice is about winners and losers in those societies. The second aspect of looking at justice in small-scale fisheries is to look at who is controlling the stories, the narratives about small-scale fisheries, and therefore the stories about justice and injustice, fairness and equity. The third aspect is recognizing the divergent views, because the stories are linked to who is telling the stories, and whether we are suppressing those voices or we are promoting those voices in terms of telling stories about justice and injustice. And then the fourth aspect is, of course, more economics, but also links to who is gaining and who is benefiting in that particular society, and therefore implications for society, and who are those people who are not actually gaining or benefiting from the outcomes of small-scale fisheries. If we look at these four aspects and put that into the context of Bay of Bengal, I would say Bay of Bengal and the small-scale fisheries in Bay of Bengal area have seen most of this on a historical, timeline. I would just give you some examples of what these communities have seen over a historical period of time. Small-scale fisheries in Bay of Bengal region, in relation to justice questions, have seen extreme forms of feudalism. If you go into the history, the jamindars, the landlords, used to control the lives and the activities of the fisheries and the fishers on that particular coast. And that was also linked to the monarchy or the kings. And some of the kings were despots and others were benevolent, but no matter how the kings were, they used to control the fishers and their lives. And therefore, it shows a number of justice questions, from a historical point of view. The kings were so powerful that the first fish or the first catch of the day would go to the king, or else there is punishment for the fishers. The third experience in this region has been about 300 years of colonial rule, starting from the Portuguese to British, 300 years of colonial rule, and the oppression and the structural and normative changes that was brought by colonial rule in that particular region, and the impact on small-scale fisheries. Example is, you still pay tax under a colonial rule even if you don't have income, and this tells millions of stories about justice and equity and fairness in that society. Post-independence, these societies have seen unfriendly and uncaring governments and their policies. They have seen struggles with rapid increase and intensification of caste systems, entrenched caste systems, where fishers actually are at the lowest rungs of the caste society. They have taken the brunt of globalization and marketization, including de facto privatization, where their customary fishing areas have been encroached and taken over by powerful mafias. And in the recent decades, this region has seen the impacts of course, what we are talking about today, the blue economy and its consequences. Tourism, industry, ports, aquaculture, and all these things have taken over the lives and the activities and therefore influence. The question here is, how do we talk about justice in such an intense context? Do we create new definitions, or do we look at the history? Do we look at the current processes? How do we talk about justice? And what justice could mean from the perspective of fishers in this critical and intense context? I would like to talk about 3 different ways that the fishers look at. And of course, it links to the theory of justice that many of us have read about. The first aspect of this particular experience takes us to distributive justice, which is actually outcome-oriented. It looks at how the society in small-scale fishing context is taking care of sharing, allocations, and entitlements. How the distribution of all these outcomes of small-scale fisheries takes place, and therefore its implications for justice. The second aspect is procedural justice, which is, of course, and obviously linked to the processes that are in place within the fishing society and outside the fishing society, and therefore the implications of these processes for injustice or justice. So this refers to democratic, inclusive, fair procedures being in place to ensure justice or therefore injustice. The third aspect is the corrective justice aspect, which says, we need to focus on repair and rectification. We need to confess that there has been historical injustices that have been made, and therefore we need to take steps at the current time to repair those historical injustices within the small-scale fishing societies. It is our duty to repair the loss and the damage that has been caused. There is no shying away from that particular notion that it is our duty. But the way corrective justice has been seen in the societies, it always amounts to compensation, which says, provided compensation has been paid, an otherwise unjust action is acceptable. And we don't accept that kind of a notion of corrective justice. Corrective justice is not compensatory justice. It takes us to the domain of normative, structural, and functional justice, because we need to ensure justice in all these three areas, in the norms and principles, in the structures of the society of the fishing context, and the functional aspects of justice. In the Bay of Bengal area, we have been seeing that small-scale fishing communities have been experiencing not only single, not only double, but sometimes double, triple, or more different types of injustices. I'll give you an example. I talked about historical or ongoing injustices, which talks about small-scale fishing societies being marginalized over a historical period of time. So people are aware of historical injustices. That is one type of justice that small-scale fishing societies are experiencing. The second type of injustice is what I would term as the surprise or unexpected type of injustice. And Moiniba has already referred to the COVID-19, and which I would put in the unexpected and surprise injustice, because no one expected that COVID-19 would come and then snatch away many elements of small-scale fishing societies and people that they had never thought about. So surprise or unexpected injustice. The third type of injustice or source of injustice is recurring or anticipated injustice in that particular region. And I will give an example of cyclones or disasters. On an average, we are seeing over the last couple of years, there is almost one super cyclone in that region every year. And forget about the smaller cyclones that come. There was one on the Mumbai coast just 2 days before, and there was a super cyclone kind of disaster just 2 weeks back. And last year we had Philin, which was a super cyclone again. So people are witnessing these recurring and anticipated factors that influences how justice is served and maintained in a society. And now then we are talking about blue injustices that comes in many sizes and shapes to talk about economic development as it links to injustice. So we're seeing a trend from B justice, which is blue justice, to D justice, as I would say, disaster justice. And these transitions and interactions between different types of injustice are intensifying in that particular region. So we're moving from B justice, or we are adding on D justice or D justice, which creates a messy and wicked situation to talk about justice in that particular region. And all of these different types of sources of justice actually have a synergistic contribution, because they don't act on their own, they combine forces with each other. So the historical injustice combine forces with the blue justice, and they intensify injustices in the society. Think of other alphabets coming in. So I talked about B justice and D justice, so we might be seeing E justice, which is the economy in blue justice. So think of other kinds of injustice and sources of injustice unfolding in that particular region. So we need to be prepared. We need to be prepared as people, as group who are concerned about small-scale fisheries. The fisher friends that we work with need to be alert and prepared. The governments need to think and act outside the bureaucratic box to act. Civil society needs to be more caring and selfless, and give attention to small-scale fisheries injustice issues. Academia needs to move out and go beyond the business-as-usual comfort. We all need to gear towards transdisciplinarity, interdisciplinarity, and which suggests that we need to go out of our comfort zones to talk about injustice, to work on injustice, to do something fruitful in collaboration with multiple small-scale fisheries people and societies. In conclusion, I would reflect on 2 points. My one point of conclusion is a question that I ask. Is blue justice a necessary corollary of blue economy? Are we talking about blue justice because there is blue economy? What I have reflected in my previous few minutes is that there is the injustice in small-scale fishing societies that we have talked about are more historical and systemic. We cannot run away from them. So if we say yes to blue justice being a necessary corollary of blue economy, then we run the risk of putting to rest the notion that injustice is historical and it is systemic. We are going to run away from that, and that is going to be dangerous. If we say no to this particular question of whether blue justice is a necessary corollary of blue economy, then we still run the risk of evading many justice implications of blue economy. And it is actually unfolding day by day. New kinds of pressures, new kinds of impacts, and therefore new kinds of injustice questions. The key challenge here, as I would pose to this forum today, is that we need to carefully navigate this conundrum. And I call this a blue conundrum, which talks about the linkages between blue justice and blue economy. A blue conundrum that needs to be addressed in all its phases. In my final conclusion, I would talk about small-scale fisheries and injustice, and what is the possibility of bringing justice to these societies. Yes, small-scale fisheries are marginalized, but there are inherent strengths in those societies that have kept these societies going. They have not failed. They have been very successful. They have been contributing to the economy. They have been contributing to the society and the global processes. The strengths in these small-scale fisheries need to be harnessed, need to be brought out in our discussions about justice and injustice. The strengths in these small-scale fisheries can then help the small-scale fishing communities to move beyond injustice and become viable only if we work on it in a collaborative way. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prateek, for that. That was very interesting to hear the perspective, and you brought a lot of that historical issue to share as well. So thank you for that. We will go into the discussion after in a little while, but for now, I would like to invite our next speaker. Still have 2 more to go, so we're going to have to speed up a little bit here, just so that we have time for discussion. Now, Julie, you have your yes, presentation almost ready.
Yes.
Very good. Okay, so the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ratana. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm very honored. I will. My presentation is going to focus on blue justice from a legal perspective. It will not touch upon, of course, on the aspects of blue justice itself, but more and how I understand as this legal perspective contributing to bring justice to small-scale fisheries. And the first question I'd like to address is, why is social injustice happening to small-scale fisheries? And it's a big question. It deals with, of course, all the aspects and issues that Professor Khatib and Professor Muniba have spoken about. The vulnerability and marginalization of small-scale fisheries, the low financial and technical capacity, literacy, the geographical isolation of small-scale fisheries, which prevents them and puts them in a situation, in difficult situations, in which they are more subjected to suffer from social injustice. And one key aspect I'd like to focus is this unclear legal coverage, which also reflects injustice in the small-scale fisheries context. And small-scale fisheries have been overlooked by law, and that reflects this injustice from international level and also to the country level. At international level, you have, since the beginning, of course, very much before this 1982 Law of the Sea Convention, but the Law of the Sea Convention is considered the constitution for the ocean. So it is surprising to see that even this convention has not addressed small-scale fisheries. And there is a growing number of scholars that are exploring how to connect human rights and social dimensions to bring that to the Law of the Sea Convention. But originally, it hasn't really covered small-scale fisheries, and that's a big problem. And small-scale fisheries have then been considered only in the 1995 Fish Stocks Agreement, which is an implementing agreement of that convention, and deals with the management and conservation of straddling fish stocks and highly migratory fish stocks. In this agreement, you had already some very few provisions on addressing small-scale fisheries, but still in a limited way. And also in the 1995 FAO Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries, which applies generally to small-scale fisheries and have some specific provisions that address artisanal subsistence fishing, as they are referred to, and falls under the scope of small-scale fisheries, local communities and coastal communities as well. But it took a long time for them to finally come to the moment where in 2014, the FAO Committee on Fisheries endorsed the voluntary guidelines for securing sustainable small-scale fisheries in the context of food security and poverty eradication, as we know, the small-scale fisheries guidelines. And that's how I see how international law has been important and in elevating this important issue to the international agenda, and raising attention to not only small-scale fisheries as being important to conservation and management of fisheries, as usually international fisheries law instruments are focused on, but also addressing social development, climate change, gender equality, and all sorts of different issues that are important for small-scale fisheries. So that has also pushed forward other initiatives. So you had in 2017 also this model law for small-scale fisheries adopted by the Latin American Parliament. And in 2018, the UN Human Rights Council also endorsed the Declaration on the Rights of Peasants, which applies to small-scale fishing expressly, and it's because it's covering peasants, it's more related to inland fisheries, perhaps, and somehow complements the SSF guidelines, which are more focused on capture fisheries. And I mean, all these instruments should be read in combination, as they are all important to small-scale fisheries. But yet, at country level, the problem still remains, as injustice is still there in small-scale fisheries, and this unclear legal coverage at national level persists. So what is missing? What is there to do? Unclear does not mean insufficient. We have plenty of legal instruments already in place. Even Constitution addresses important elements of human rights and environmental rights. In some countries, of course, legislations, administrative orders, which may have a nature of have a normative effect, depending on the country. We have all these instruments, but still there's things to be done. And so I thought about how justice can be promoted, fostered to small-scale fisheries context, coming from a legal perspective, and how can international law, through the SSF guidelines, bring justice to small-scale fisheries at country level. And I'd like to raise attention to this case study that Professor Fabio Hazin and I developed, focusing on Brazil and on the federal law on the National Policy for the Sustainable Development of Aquaculture and Fisheries, which is our primary law and policy on fisheries, and how it is aligned with the small-scale fisheries guidelines. We have explored that in this article, and we have, of course, identified many gaps with respect to the issues that the SSF guidelines cover. But that does not mean necessarily that this law needs, that there isn't the legal framework in general is not sufficient. I mean, it's not cannot be somehow complemented by other legislation, and we have identified several other legislations from other fields of law outside the fisheries domain, which speaks to those issues of the SSF guidelines, and which could apply to the small-scale fisheries context. So they should be considered all together in a complementary way, in an integrated way, to ensure that all issues that are relevant to our small-scale fisheries are covered. And particularly, through the human rights-based approach and the ecosystem approach to fisheries, which calls for participatory approaches, making sure that also small-scale fisheries are considered in decision-making and also participate in conservation management measures. And all these issues and all these other policies are extremely important and should be considered and should be well understood, so that they can apply and can foster the small-scale fisheries guidelines implementation. So in a nutshell, I think one of the three messages that I would like to leave is how important it is to understand the national policies and laws that are in place in a country, because it may be that there is already a legal framework, legal and policy framework that is strong and that can be applied to the small-scale fishery context. If it is general enough to be applied to anyone, it can be applied to the small-scale fisheries context to address those issues that are relevant and can then bring can contribute for them to have the capacity to look for their rights, to combat injustice in their field, and how important it is to enhance cross-sectoral collaboration. So all those sectors that are working with human rights, in particular with climate change or with environmental issues, that they should know well these laws that are applicable to their fields and how they can be applicable to the small-scale fisheries context, and promote this coordination and coherent applications of legislation and policies. Communicate well as to ensure that small-scale fisheries have access to justice and have the means to do so, and then they can use the policies and laws that are in place for them. I think this is my presentation. I don't know if I was too fast.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
All right. So I'm gonna try to. Well, I would invite now our next speaker, and we'll return to this very important topic that you brought up in terms of the legal perspective. So let me let me I'll just remove you for a little bit now, and then would invite Sven and to the studio now. And I have your presentation, Sven. So all you have to do is say next. I will move the slide for you.
Okay. Thank you to the organizers for letting me speak here today, and thank you for asking me to address a very interesting, important, and increasingly urgent issue of social justice in the blue economy, as seen from the perspective of small-scale fishers. Now we have the voluntary guidelines for securing sustainable small-scale fisheries, which were a landmark achievement when FAO member states endorsed them 6 years ago in June. I believe that if states do nothing to implement these guidelines, the blue economy will for certain come at a loss to small-scale fisheries. That the many injustices that they are experienced today and have for a long time experienced will only be exacerbated. We obviously need to document what the blue economy, which is now underway around the world, what it does to the justice of small-scale fisheries people and their communities. Are their justice concerned recognized? Do they lose? Do they win? The justice issue has been with us since humans started to form groups and communities. It never went away and probably never will. Up through history, people have been thinking hard and long about what justice is and who deserves it. One cannot and should not, in my opinion, discuss the blue justice concept without visiting this ancient old philosophical discourse. Also because it is very much alive today. This is not the time and place to go much into the depth of this discourse. That will be an issue for the next TBTI book that Ratana, Moniba, Alicia Said, and myself are working on. Let me instead offer some reflections on how we should approach the blue justice issues as a research topic. For that, we would need some analytical framework to guide us, an analytical framework which is broad and deep enough to capture the many complexities and dimensions of blue justice, which, for instance, Prateep talked about. People familiar with the TBTI literature will know that we have repeatedly and systematically drawn on so-called interactive governance theory to direct our research, as it was originally spelled out by Professor Jan Koyman in the Netherlands. Ratana and I and other colleagues have worked with him for many years until he passed away, and we have continued to do so to elaborate and apply his theory. Thus, we believe that the blue justice concept could be fruitfully assessed at what Koyman termed the three orders of governance. And could you please show the first slide? Ratan, are you still around?
I am still around, but for some reason the slide doesn't move. Sorry about that, Sven. Let me try something. There it is.
There it is. No, the previous one. You can see these three orders in this table, and you can see what they refer to and what kind of research questions that apply and can be raised with regard to the different orders with regard to blue justice. I will return to this table many times, and maybe you can just shift to the second one. Ratana, there you are. The third meta-governance order includes message, images, values, and norms within a particular social system, and how they convert into, for instance, justice principles in a small-scale fisheries governance context. As we heard yesterday, the governance principles of of the small-scale fisheries guidelines derive from human rights standards. However, which we also heard during this week and today, these are not necessarily the justice principles that are valid at national and local levels. Is there then a gap between the principles of the small-scale fisheries guidelines and those of the current governance system under scrutiny? And secondly, is there a similar gap between the justice principles of the governance system on the one hand and those of small-scale fisheries communities on the other? Small-scale fisheries people may well have different ideas of justice than that of government and the small-scale fisheries guidelines. We cannot know this unless we have checked it empirically, but we should certainly do this because it will affect governance processes and outcomes. Take, for instance, the famous difference principles of the philosopher John Rawls. Next slide, please. It says that social and economic inequalities are to satisfy two conditions. First, they are to be attached to offices and positions open to all under conditions of fair equality and of opportunity. And second, they are to be to the greatest benefit of the least advantaged members of society. You will recognize the difference principles in, for instance, Thomas Piketty's, the famous French economist, and his definition of social justice. Next slide, please. Which could also work for small-scale fisheries, just replace members with small-scale fishers or fisher people. States should, whenever appropriate, grant preferential access to small-scale fisheries. No, that is not it. It's a just society is one that allows all of its members access to the widest possible range of fundamental goods and organizes socioeconomic relations, property rights, and the distribution of income and wealth in such a way as to allow its its least advantaged members to enjoy the highest possible life condition. This was Thomas Piketty. You can also find this principle several places in the small-scale fisheries guidelines, like, for instance, in Article 5.7. Next slide, please. In particular, vulnerable groups. It talks about preferential access of small-scale fisheries. Well, that's the difference principle. Is this principle then honored in the governance system under investigation? If not, why? If yes, how? These are questions that we could ask. Then the next slide. At the second governance order, the focus is on institutions and the organizations that have as a role to ensure that rules are just. For instance, with regard to representation of small-scale fisheries, then do existing access rules discriminate against small-scale fishers? Do small-scale fishers have equitable rights of access to the decision-making process where rules that affect them are established? Which Rawls says they should. This is about what is called procedural justice, as also Pratib mentioned. With two Swedish colleagues, I'm currently working on a chapter for the Blue Justice book where we demonstrate that in the Swedish fisheries governance system, small-scale fisheries fall outside the advisory and decision-making system. Instead, the system is primarily working in the interest of the large-scale fisheries sector. In the Swedish fisheries governance system, we argue that injustice is not so much at the third order as at the second governance order. We would also look for justice gaps at the second governance order. Multiple governance institutions may work side by side and in competition with each other. Some are of the government, others are of the community, some are informal, some are recent, some are customary. Justice must also be assessed within customary institutions, for instance, with regard to their inclusiveness. Do they, for instance, discriminate against women? Are women represented? Commenting on John Rawls' theory of justice, including his difference principle, Amartya Sen, in his book The Idea of Justice, argues that there is more to social justice than justice principles and just institutions. Next slide, please. Yes, this is the book. Highly readable. We need, he argues in this book, investigate how justice plays out in the daily life of people, in the freedoms they actually have, the capabilities they possess, and the choices they have or do not have, and the choices they actually make. Institutions guide and steer, but do not necessarily determine interactions, at least not to the full. Just rules are helpful, but no guarantee that justice is served. Therefore, justice is also an issue at the first governance order. Please, next slide. Here we look at actions and interactions, and we ask how do power relations affect small-scale fisheries on a daily basis and so forth. Institutions set limitations and install and enforce sanctions, but may also provide opportunities for irregular behavior. Governments sometimes abuse their authority. Practices may also be corrupt. People do not always follow the rules, or they succeed to bend them in their particular interest. They are often involved in strategic games for power and resources. Fisheries governance involves a policy process where discursive power matters. To secure your rights is not just an issue of having right, but also of getting right. For the latter, you would often need to provide convincing arguments. Then words matter because we need them to define the problem and legitimize our actions, whether they fulfill principles of justice or not. Therefore, to acquire discursive or rhetorical power is in such strategic games, euphemisms are handy as tool because they help to disarm and silence your opponents. There is, of course, nothing wrong with the concepts like blue economy and blue growth as such. They are neutral and hard to reject and could apply everywhere. We always had a blue economy. The problem starts when we now start to put things into these concepts. If they, for instance, promote corporate interest and forget about small-scale fisheries, which they tend to do. Then small-scale fisheries have reason to be wary about these concepts. The blue economy does not have to be like that, but the gap between talk and practice is certainly an issue for empirical inspection and criticism because of the hypocrisy they involve. Next slide. Notice the vertical arrows in the table going up and down. In an ideal world, there will be consistency between the orders. Justice principles at the third order would determine the design of institutions at the second order, and in the next instance, the governance interaction at the first order. Yet we know that this, in practice, is not necessarily so. Next slide, please. This is another quote from Piketty in his last book, in his latest book. It is wise to be wary of abstract and general principles of social justice and to concentrate instead on the way in which those principles are embodied in specific societies and concrete policies and institutions. The gap between governance orders is not always easy to reveal or close. Thus, the dissonance between meta-order principles, second-order rules, and first-order interactions may persist, and we must try to understand why this is so. For instance, the small-scale fisheries guidelines justice principle may not trickle down to the lower orders, where business as usual prevails. Neither may the values, norms, and justice principles that guide people's daily social interactions trickle up and contribute to institutional and normative change in the way small-scale fisheries are governed. Thereby, the justice gaps persist, especially if it has powerful supporters. To quote David Miller in his book, Principles of Justice from 2013, he says, then justice comes to mirror too closely prevailing institutions and practices rather than serving to assess them critically. The blue economy will test how serious FAO members were when they endorsed the small-scale fisheries guidelines. State committed themselves to respect and enhance a series of justice principles like the difference principles. Will they do so in the blue economy? Notably, small-scale fisheries people and other stakeholders do not all need to agree what these ideal principles are or what they should be before they act to correct the gaps. Even if they do not have the conceptual sophistication of a professional philosopher, they would still know injustice when they see it. And the small-scale fisheries guidelines give them a lot to go by. Again, following Piketty, third order justice principles are not sufficient to secure justice, but they are both a start and a yardstick for the evaluation of processes and outcomes. But justice institutions are not sufficient either, says Amartya Sen. Just institutions are necessary, but they are not enough. Therefore, to secure blue justice, we cannot stop with the formation of just institutions at the second governance order. We must also continue to the first order. That is where the final justice litmus test must take place, since justice is, and I quote Amartya Sen, ultimately connected with the way people's lives go, and not merely with the nature of the institutions surrounding them. Thus, we do not need to wait for conceptual clarification and in institutional perfection. We can still act to reveal and correct injustices as we see them also in the blue economy. Let me then close with a quote from Amartya Sen's book, which says, and please, the next slide. If a theory of justice is to guide recent choice of policies, strategies, or institutions, then the identification of fully just social arrangements is neither necessary nor sufficient. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Sven. Okay, so we do have time for questions and discussions. So we have now seen quite a lot of questions coming in. So I'm going to bring back our speakers so that we can have the conversation. Prateep has to step out for a little bit, but he would join us soon, I hope. Okay, so I have been basically trying to figure it out, right? How best to start these question discussions, simply because there are a lot of people who really are interested in, you know, the actual examples on the ground, but also from, you know, the theoretical perspective, from the academic researcher, what we need to do. But then also, you know, this big question about, you know, when we talk about blue justice, are we, how do we deal with the fact that blue economy and ocean development is happening anyway? Are we going to be sidelined? Are we going to be sidelining small-scale fisheries if we are talking about blue justice? Why these other blue economy and other blue agenda is happening? Can we kind of like get that general opinion on that one, just to make sure that, you know, it's similar to what you're saying, in that might be nothing wrong so much with blue economy, but when blue economy is not doing what it's supposed to do, then things can go very bad for small-scale fisheries. But maybe that's not the shared opinion here. So maybe Moniba, would you like to just speak a little bit on that?
Thank you, Ratana, for your question. I think that, you know, I think when we're talking about there's nothing wrong in terms of the blue economy and also sidelining small-scale fishers, I think what we actually want to raise is the issue that the blue economy is sidelining small-scale fishers. That is the reality. If we look at cases around the continent, when it comes to oil and gas and energy farming, small-scale fisheries become insignificant in terms of what the foreign investment that mean, or currency that means to the government. And the role of the state is critical in terms of, on the one hand, we would expect them to protect small-scale fishers, and we expect them to protect their rights, their access, and their vulnerability of small-scale fishers. But on the other hand, they are making space, or they create a conducive environment, as Sven mentioned, for business as usual. So I think for blue justice is not trying to antagonize the blue economy, but to raise the issues of the blue economy. And if we want to relate the issues of the blue economy and in terms of COVID-19, I think we should really think of new forms of doing things, and the kind of massive economic drive in terms of the ocean is not the economic system that is necessarily good for sustainable livelihoods of small-scale fisheries, neither is it good for the ocean. So I think it is unpacking the agenda of small-scale, of the blue economy. Now challenging the blue economy Does that mean that we have to be sidelined and not benefit out of the blue economy? I don't think that should be the case. But it also, governments do not want to be challenged and also do not want to be raised the issue. Governments do not want us to raise the issues around their violations of basic human rights when it comes to their own people. So for me, it is trying to get meaningful space for small-scale fisheries to practice their livelihood and to benefit from their own systems and economic systems. Thank you.
Thank you. So welcome back, Pratik, for that. So we're just talking about making sure that small-scale fisheries would not be, further marginalized if we decided that, we're going to have these kind of, some people see when we talk about blue justice, it's almost like we're anti-development, right? Which is what Maniba suggested here, that, this is not about that, but it's about bringing a really fruitful conversation around these. So we will try this question here because we got this question, right? Because it's kind of related to what both Svein and Pratik, and I wanted to hear also the legal perspective from Julia, right? So we know that, I think one of you said, just because we have this multi-stakeholder process doesn't mean that it will make everything just and fair, right? So how to really go about that? How to really bring more procedural justice into this space and make the small-scale fishery voices bigger. So I'd like to invite our panelists here to speak to this question. Would you like to start, Pratik?
Yeah, of course. So when we talk about procedural justice, we have to see, at what scale procedures, lie. In terms of procedural justice, it has been imposed from outside. The processes that are always defined and imposed from outside, especially by government policies and government plans and programs. But we also see and experience a wide variety of procedures and processes at the community level, and of course with less recognition, not often talked about. But there is enough processes. We talk about institutional processes, we talk about cultural and other processes, economic processes, but we need to highlight those things, and the voice to the fishers would come when you start to highlight those existing processes and bring them up, and not to replace with government or other external processes, but to collaborate and but to work in synergy with them. So the state exists, but at the same time, the subjects of the state, quote unquote, have a say in how they want to lead the process and establish processes at their end. And that might lead to a more broadening up of justice discussions at that level.
You see, because a lot of people have been interested in this topic, right? When we really brought up this important point. So like Tanya spoke, commented from Australia here about how it's vital to human dignity even. Julia, you have any recommendation or any advice when it comes to, from the legal perspective, what does it all mean for small-scale fishing communities?
All right, thank you. I think based on the case study again in Brazil, I think there were many good examples that we found with respect to procedural rights and access to justice. And I think that there is one important example is the itinerary justice, that it was a project that was implemented in some states in Brazil, through which civil servants were bringing this procedure that remote areas do not have access to for them, so they could have at least some legal administrative measures in place, birth certificates and recognition of marriage or things like that, identification. So this was something that helped countries that were located in remote areas. And also, I think one important aspect in procedural justice is to understand how small-scale fishers and small-scale fishing communities can be represented in court. And one example that also is relevant, I think, from Brazil is civil a constitutional action that was filed by National Confederation of Fishers and Aquaculturists, which challenged the fact that they did not receive the benefits from a closed season, which they were entitled to, and so I think these are some good examples to which countries could perhaps bring justice where small-scale fishers do not have access to, and how how can small-scale fishers be represented, and how their voices can be heard through those institutions that represent them, in the case of Confederation of Fishers.
Yeah. Thank you for that. So Sven, I mean, there are, people talk, I mean, you brought up a lot of scholars who actually have been looking at this topic from, not in a context of small scale fisheries. Can you just summarize again to us what we can learn from that in terms of, how to really make these more of a reality on the ground? We have this comment from Lina, for instance, speaking about the fact that there's so many of these, challenges that we are already facing. So can you just speak on that, please?
Well, I think we have a lot to learn from them. First of all, because they're wise people, and therefore drawing on them empowers yourself in the argument, your own participation in the process, that you're not just coming from nothing, but you're coming from a history of thinking and reflection about what we are actually asking for when we ask for more social justice. Take this issue of participation, for instance. Amartya Sen in this book make a strong argument that justice is about more than distribution. It's also about social process. It's about participation. It matters for people, not just because more participation brings potentially better outcomes for small-scale fisheries, but also because it is important in itself as a principle. People have a right to be involved, and we have been arguing this in a fisheries context for quite some time now. That we need to look at how our governance systems are structured, are organized. This is to a large extent about organization, and we need to argue that there are different ways of organizing decision-making process that allows this argument of Amartya Sen to have an effect. To me, that is what our co-management is all about, and that's the position we come from. And although we know that it is still in very often just an issue of rhetoric, we also see examples around the world that it's actually being implemented and it's been written into their legislation and so forth. And I think that's very encouraging. And we have made an impact in that. We have argued for this, and I think our argumentation piece is better, more nuanced, and stronger if we can situate in this broader discourse that is beyond small-scale fisheries per se. I was very encouraged by what Barack Obama said here the other day, and that also is an issue for us as academics. He says, make those in power uncomfortable. And I think we do have a role to make those in power who do all they can to secure that status quo work in their interest, make them uncomfortable. And I do think we have a role to play, but our argument would then need to be strong and sophisticated and learned. Thank you.
You kind of answered this question that in terms of how to deal with the from the academic perspective, right? So unfortunately, we really are running out of time. But I wanted to give everybody, a final, the last round to really talk about what would you like to leave the audience with in terms of the take-home message, and how would you, what, we're going to continue the conversation on Monday. What would be some of the things that you want them to continue to think about as we are moving into, the discussion on Monday? Maybe we'll start from Moniba, please.
Sorry, I was responding to a comment from our colleague Alida around.
So Alida just sent in a comment. Okay, let's
send a comment, and I was focusing on her comment.
Right. Yeah.
And I wanted to ask her to refer to the talk right at the beginning, because those were the key issues that I mentioned, and also refer to her husband's work on unpacking the human rights in terms of the neoliberal approach. So that made me kind of only listen half to your question, Ratana. What was your question again?
Well, basically, I think we need to wrap this up, and basically, I am trying to. I'm going to give everybody an opportunity to just just conclude with your final remarks on the kind of take-home message that you wanted to leave with the audience, especially as we go into a Monday discussion. Okay.
I think for me, Monday's discussion would be very interesting, because we're getting a young, very powerful scholar, Bram Buscher, who's really going to unpack the notion of conservation, and that we look at conservation and the crisis narrative in more detail when we can't just accept that there's an environmental crisis without looking at how that environmental crisis is being used also to force people out of their right for livelihood and in terms of their particular justice. So for me, I think that it is important to continue the conversation to kind of unpack the not only the powerful narratives around business as usual in terms of the blue economy, but also it cannot be business as usual when it comes to the conservation narratives. We really need to unpack that. So that is my take-home message, and I hope to see many of you on Monday for that talk.
Thank you. That's great. And you did say that in your presentation, gave us a lot of points to think about. So it would be best if all of us would just review view the video again and listen and really, many times, just so that we're reminded of that. Prateep, would you like to just say something briefly so that?
Yes, 2 points. One, we're going to hear a lot more stories about blue justice and blue economy. I want to emphasize whose stories we want to hear and not lose track of who is telling the story. I'm not saying that we don't listen to the stories told by a certain group of people, but we need to prioritize whose stories we hear. And that is important in pursuing blue justice, blue economy, or any kind of justice issues in small-scale fisheries. The second point that I want to make is, we have all emphasized in this webinar that justice issues have been historically there. It is generations old, and they have not gone away anywhere. But we are going to face new kinds of justice issues with new types of models like blue justice. While we should be working on those new justice issues, we should not be forgetting or putting aside the existing ongoing systemic and historical injustice that we have not resolved yet. So we should not lose track of that either. Those are the 2 points I want to make.
That's good. Thank you. Julie.
Thank you very much. I think my message would be more with respect to, of course, law and how it's important to understand well the legislations that are in place and how they can complement each other in the implementation of the SSF guidelines. And that in the implementation of the SSF guidelines do not necessarily mean that you have to adopt a new legislation or amend a new legislation, but most importantly is to better understand what the existing legal framework can provide for in an integrated and complementary manner.
That's great. And we can read your paper that you have published about the case. By the way, so many people are really asking for the literature to be put as resources for further reading. So we would do that on our website so that you can read more, because Muniba mentioned a lot of literature, and so as Sven, and we have paper from both Prateep and Julie as well. So Sven, briefly, please.
Yeah, I have two points. I make them quickly. One is related to what Alida said about neoliberalism and capitalism. I think this discussion belongs here, but it's not always clear to me whether those that talk about neoliberalism are for capitalism. They're just against the deregulation of the markets. If that is the only concern that they have, then the justices or the injustices that is imminent in capitalism per se will remain. So I think these are two issues that needs to be discussed at the same time. It's not enough to discuss neoliberalism. That's my first point. The other point relates to what I said before. I think we are now in a different situation because of these SSF guidelines. The SSF guidelines are not just empowering to small-scale fisheries, but they are also empowering to the academic community. We have a role to secure that we don't forget about them. That from now on we just talk about the blue economy as if the small-scale fisheries guidelines do not exist. We have to make sure that this instrument, like so many other instruments, survive this blue economy, that they are drawn into this blue economy discourse and not just forgotten. And we as academics, we have to make sure that doesn't happen, that we remind ourselves and we remind those in power that they do sign up to and endorse the small scale fisheries, and that to me is a way to make them feel or be uncomfortable.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. I think the audience would agree with me that this has been a wonderful session with so much of your experience and really deep thinking around this, right? So I really like to thank everybody for your wonderful presentations, and for the audience for those very engaging questions and discussion. So I'm gonna try to close this session very quickly, but I have many people ask me, right, what is gonna happen during these the week that we're gonna be on Monday, when we talk about these arts and everything. So I thought that I will just introduce to you an example of what you would see on Monday. And now it's going to be with my a guest appearance of Asade, who's going to, try to turn. Can you say something quickly first, Asade?
Hi all. I'm happy that I'm with you.
Okay, so just introduce yourself, who you are.
Okay, I am Azadeh and I'm from Iran. I'm a music student at Memorial University of Newfoundland, and I'm doing my master's in guitar performance pedagogy.
Okay, so the reason why Asade is in the studio with us is because she's going to perform a song for us. So I'm going to let you do that. And then the speakers, please don't go away yet. I'm going to, once you finish the performance, we're going to close the studio, but I still like to talk to you about Monday. Oops, sorry, not me. You want you.
Okay. I was born by the sea, just a fisher for me. Easy life, but never seen, and we is just a dream. Big guys fish, the water's bare, and the tourists came to stare at a little boat there, and we is just a prayer. All the seas under the sun are enough for everyone if the big bad boats are gone. justice guarantee. Happy justice guarantee. Happy justice guarantee.
Thank you. Thank you. You don't, it's hard to appreciate what you have just done online like this, but that was a beautiful song, and we will put the lyrics for everybody to see later on. Okay, so thank you everybody again for joining us for today, and I would then, yeah, we'll just say goodbye because it's very late already, and we'll see you again on Monday. Bye everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.